Thank you. You are welcome to this channel. We thank you for subscribing. If you have not done so, please just click the subscribe button and you will be viewing our many series that we release every week. Today we'll be talking about the law of tithes and tithing. Now, what is tithe? Where did it originate? Are we supposed to pay tithes today? Now, the first time we find tithe in the Bible is found in the book of Genesis chapter 14 and verse 20. Abraham's nephew was captured, and when he went and rescued his nephew, whose name was Lot, on his way back, he decided to give a tenth of the spoils to Melchizedek. You find that in Genesis chapter 14, verse 20. Abraham did that voluntarily. He was not asked by God. The second time you find tithes is when Jacob pledged to give a tenth of everything. He said, if God will be with him, and he will go and come back, and he will bless him, he will give a tenth of all what God had given to him back to God. That was Genesis chapter 28, from verse 20 right down to 22. We find out in these two people, they gave voluntarily. They were not commissioned, they were not asked, they were not forced to give. Now, when the children of Israel became a nation, God made a covenant with them on Mount Sinai in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 1 to 5. He said, God demanded a tenth of all the produce of the land of Canaan from them in Leviticus chapter 27, verse 30. Whatever the land yielded, they were supposed to give 1/10 to God. And this is the first time that God demanded a tenth from men. Now, under the Old Testament, many people know just of tithe, but there are different types of tithe that have existed. There is the general tithe, where the whole produce of the land, 1/10 was taken from it. And when this 1/10 was taken from it every year, it was given to the Levites. The Levites in turn gave a tithe of what was given to them to the priests. Now let us be very clear on this. When the land yielded the produce, the people were to give 1/10 of that produce to the Levites. Remember, the Levites had no inheritance. And these Levites in turn gave 1/10 of what was given to them to the priest. That is the first tithe. Now there is another tithe that is mentioned. That tithe is mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 22 to 27. It's to be eaten by the giver and his household with the Levites. That is the second tithe. There is a third tithe that is mentioned at the end of 3 years, usually called the poor tithe. In this third year, all the tithe of the produce of the land was to be stored in all cities, and this was taken to Jerusalem, but it was eaten by the Levites and the poor. Apart from this third year tithe, which was formed of the second year, all the tithes must be taken to Jerusalem. They were forbidden to offer their tithes in any place other than the place that God has chosen to place his name. Now, where did God place his name? God finally chose the temple at Jerusalem as the place to place his name. You find that in 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 5 to 6. Therefore, the tithe must be and was taken to Jerusalem. Those far away were to sell their goods, and in turn, they will buy something that they will use for the festival. That is how we find in John chapter 2, verse 14, it talks to us about the money changers at the temple. Because those who were far away, they will sell that tithe, and they will change it for money, and when they come back, they will use that money and buy something that they will use for the festival. Now, a storehouse was prepared in the temple for keeping the tithe brought for the Levites. Therefore, the tithe we read about in the Bible is not what you can pay wherever you find yourself. It must be taken to Jerusalem. All of us will agree that today tithes are not taken to Jerusalem. Now, what about Malachi chapter 3, verse 8 to 10? An understanding of this passage of the Bible will liberate many people. It is not addressed to Christians, but the children of Israel. God made a covenant with the children of Israel on Mount Sinai. You will find it in Exodus chapter 19, verse 5. In the law of this covenant, it was determined that the tenth of all the produce of the land of Canaan is the Lord's. Leviticus chapter 27, right down to chapter 30. The Lord promised some covenant blessings if they obeyed and kept all the ordinances. And he threatened some covenant curses should they disobey. Now, after spending 100 years in captivity, when they return, it seemed like they had forgotten the Lord. And so in Malachi chapter 3, God recalls to them. He said, this is what I told you. And so these tithes, he was trying to recall to them. He brought back to their knowledge what he had earlier told them. He had earlier given them as a command. And so Malachi is not addressed to Christians today. God was rebuking the Israelites because they had forgotten what he told them. Now, what about the New Testament? In the New Testament, reference to tithe is found in the book of Matthew chapter 23 verse 3 once. It is found in the book of Luke chapter 11 verse 42 and chapter 18 verse 12. It is found 6 times in the book of Hebrew chapter 1 from verse 4 to 9. The paying of tithes by the scribes and the Pharisees mentioned by Jesus in Matthew and Luke was under the law. For the Old Testament was still in force until the death of Christ on the cross. You find that in Galatians chapter 4 verse 4. Now, what are we saying? The scribes and the Pharisees paid tithes because they were still under the law. Jesus lived as a Jew. He did everything as Jews did. And so the scribes and the Pharisees paid their tithes. And that's why we find tithes mentioned in Matthew, mentioned in Luke, and mentioned in Hebrew. It is mentioned because there is a change of covenant. So the Hebrew writer tells us that the old law was nailed to the cross. The old law has been replaced with a new law. And so hence the place for the new law. Now, a careful study of Hebrew chapter 7 will make it clear to any sincere person that no one has the right to take tithe from people today. The priesthood has been changed. And since the priesthood has been changed, there is also a necessity for the laws to be changed. Now, what are we saying? Remember, we said at the beginning, in the Old Testament, these tithes, there was first of all the tithe that was 1/10 of the produce of the land. They were given to the Levites. The Levites in turn gave 1/10 of what was given to them, to the priest. But today, we don't have those priests that are there to offer sacrifices. Today, who do we have? We are priests. As the book of 1 Peter chapter 2 tells us, we are priests. We are a royal priesthood. We are the priests today. So there is nobody we take tithe today to go and give. So those people who stand in today to collect tithes are not doing the right thing. They are not following what the Bible says. There is no place for tithe. And of course, they said the tithes were taken to Jerusalem. So those people today, do they carry these tithes to Jerusalem? The big answer is no. They use it for their personal benefit. They use it to do what pleases them. And so since the law has been changed, since the law was nailed to the cross, Galatians chapter 4 verse 4 has already told us that the law was our schoolmaster. Since the law was our schoolmaster, it means it has taken us to Christ. There is no reason again for us to abide by that old law. There is no place for us to pay tithe. Hebrew chapter 7 will make it very clear to us that these things, we have a better priesthood, and Christ is our high priest. He has offered himself as a sacrifice for us. So today, since we don't give tithes, we don't pay tithes anymore, what do we do today? The Bible tells us in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 6, it tells us to give sparingly. It tells us to give. It says God loves a cheerful giver. And so we are not under the law of tithe today. We have already seen that it was not only a single tithe. There were 3 different kinds of tithe that were given. We have seen that. We have seen all of those things. And so today we do not give tithe. Today we don't pay those tithes because we are not Israelite. Those laws were for the Israelite. And so today we give as God prospers us, as we find that in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 6 to 9. We give as God bless us. And he says he loves a cheerful giver. We are not under any compulsion today to give. We are not forced today to give because God did not give us the law of tithe. And so we have seen how tithe came about. We have seen that the first person to give a tithe was Abraham. We have seen that Jacob also made a pledge to God that he will give 1/10 if God will take him forth and backward. And God did, and he did that. We have seen the first time that God placed an order that 1/10 of what you have will be given. And we have seen how the Israelites, they began to give tithe. We have seen those. We have seen the different types of tithe. And so today, we are the children of God. We are under the law of Christ. He says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Christ has not asked us to give tithe. When he died on the cross, He nailed the law to the cross and he gave us a new covenant. He gave us a new law. In this new law, it is called the law of liberty. In this new law, we don't have tithing today. And so tithes, people who give tithe today, if they need to keep the law, they need to take the tithe to Jerusalem. And they need to follow all what was said. They need to give it to the Levites. And the Levites should give it to the priests. They don't give it directly to them. In the Old Testament, nobody could give directly to the priest. It was given to the Levite, and the Levite gave to the priest. But today we know people who collect directly, and they carry it. And so we need to understand that we have been freed from bondage. We should not go back to put ourselves in the bondage of making ourselves to do what the law has not asked us to do. Romans 15 verse 4 says, whatever was written before was written for our learning. And so when we learn these things, we practice what is kept for us. And today we give freely, we give liberally, so that we will be blessed and God will take all the glory. Thank you for watching. In our next series, we will be discussing about other feasts, but precisely we'll be looking at the law of purity. Thank you very much.